Hey everybody! Today we're going to be learning about the agricultural revolution. It's often called the Neolithic Revolution as well, but don't get confused because they're the same. So the agricultural revolution begins around 8000 BC and occurs after the last ice age. The major takeaways are that people now have a reliable and predictable food supply, and they can store a food surplus, whereas during their hunting and gathering days, sometimes they didn't know if they were going to be eating, or they had to travel to a new location if some type of natural disaster had impacted the food supply there. But with agriculture, there was always, not always, but most of the time, a food surplus. Plants and animals also became domesticated, which is a huge thing. Domestication means made for human use, and it's actually genetic modification. Now, the plants that we domesticated first were cereal grains. We liked emmer, wheat, and barley. And we domesticated sheep, cattle, pigs, horses, and dogs. Now, my professor actually suggested to us a theory that I had never heard about the agricultural revolution, and it's that ancient people enjoyed beer so much that once they learned how to make it, they thought, this is so great, we have to have it all the time. Let's settle down and make it. So we had a ready supply of beer thanks to the agricultural revolution. There's actually evidence for this theory in Hammurabi's Code, which we'll talk about in a later episode. If you water down someone's beer, it is okay for them to kill you. And there's pictures of ancient peoples drinking beer from a communal pot with reeds like their straws. Now, one of the biggest things that came out of the agricultural revolution is the shift in gender roles. Historians tend to believe that society was fairly egalitarian during the hunting and gathering days, but men obviously are stronger typically than women. So they would be the ones out in the fields harvesting, and they needed a lot of people to harvest all the plants. So women had to bear more children, and that confined them to the home a lot more. One of the things that they also noticed was that on skeletons from ancient women during this time, their heels, knees, backs, and toes were all really messed up, and it's because they used a quern, sometimes called a saddle quern or a rotary quern. Those are two different kinds, to crush the wheat so that they could bake it into an edible bread. Now, emmer wheat, which is what humans fell in love with, could grow in Mesopotamia, Mesoamerica, the Andean Mountains, which is kind of like where modern-day Chile is, the Nile River Valley, the Indus River Valley, and the Hung Ho River Valley in China. Notice that emmer wheat cannot grow in sub-Saharan Africa, which means that they stay in their hunter and gatherer days, so they fall behind the curve. This is a great example of how geography influences human history. Now notice, if you know anything about geography, and if you don't, I implore you to look up the location of these places on a map. All of these places that I just mentioned are above the equator but below mid-latitude, which gives you an idea of the exact conditions that emmer wheat liked to grow in. As far as animals are concerned, dogs were really good for hunting, howling, like being your built-in alarm system. I know that when my Chiweenie sees an intruder, she goes crazy and lets us know. But they're also good for getting rid of old food. They can eat your scraps. And it's important to remember that at this time they were still wolves. Some historians argue that the domestication of the dog was actually the best invention that humans could ever make. Whether you believe that or not, I'll let you do your own research and decide. Now, sheep and goats. Sheep are so sweet, and they could not make it without us. But they gave us things like wool, they gave us things like milk, and same with goats, even though they are different species. But one of the good things is that they're mobile, so you can move them around to different pastures. Cattle and pigs were domesticated by around 3000 BC, and obviously cows give us milk and meat and leather, and pigs give us meat and that sweet, sweet bacon. That might be an anachronism. I don't know when they started eating bacon. I'll have to look that up and let you know. Horses were domesticated by mid-3rd millennium BC, and they were first used for pulling because they were so mean. Humans had to really try to domesticate the horse until we could all ride them because they were just a big, nasty animal. Now, that is all taking place in Afro-Eurasia. In the New World, better known as North and South America, they had a few disadvantages because they had fewer domesticated animals. There were no pulling or riding animals because they didn't have animals as big as a horse. All they had were llamas, but llamas are small and can only carry up to 60 pounds. Another great thing to remember about the agricultural revolution is its impact that it has on land. Land becomes the key to wealth, which literally I cannot exaggerate how important this is if you want to keep learning about history. Land is the key to wealth. It's how empires happen, it's how capitalism becomes such a big success, and it all originates here because the more land you have, the more you can do with it. The more people you can sustain, the more food you can grow, the less you have to worry about eating, the less you have to worry about eating, the more you can worry about other things like math, science, history, art, government, law, everything. Military, to say one more major thing. But probably the biggest takeaway is the population explosion. I'm reading this book right now. It's called Sapiens. I would highly recommend it. But in this book, the author says that there are, during the hunter-gatherer days, like right before the agricultural revolution, fewer people on the planet than people that live in Cairo, Egypt today. Now, I just looked that up, and that's about 10 million people. By the time, okay, let me just read these facts to you. During 11,000 BC, there were less than 2 million people. 5,000 BC, which is about the time that the agricultural revolution hits, a little bit later, there are 10 million people. By 1000 BC, there are 100 million people, and by 1 AD, there are 200 million people. This is a huge lasting impact on human history. Now, civilization becomes another key factor, the urban revolution. The word citizen is Latin, which means tied to your city, which makes a whole lot of sense when you think about people and that they weren't moving around as much. In the olden days, about 5,000 people was a city, about the size of, I believe, Winfield, Alabama, if I'm not mistaken. And to have a city, you need a big diversification of labor. You need law enforcement, military, lawyers and judges, farmers and harvesters, vendors, businessmen, banks, tax collectors, and taxes, builders to make houses, to make churches, if you want to call them that, or places of religious worship. You need blacksmiths or weapon makers, streets, monumental architecture, doctors, or some type of medicine practitioner, civil engineers, writers, mathematicians, teachers. The list goes on and on and on. In the next episode, we're going to cover some of these specific civilizations and why they're important to human history. I'll see y'all in the next episode. Thanks!